Welcome everyone to this new Greytalk. Today's title is Reflections on Social Justice and the World of Work, Possible Global Futures. Today we have the privilege to have with us Brian Langille, Professor of Law at the University of Toronto, and Anne Trebilcock, former ILO legal advisor. They both will offer insights from the recent book and include elements from post-publication exchanges that they had, including highlights from Francis Maupain's own remarks at the event that took place in Geneva in July 2023 to launch their book, published by Hart Bloomsbury in 2023. So as usual, Manuela Tortora will lead the session, and we'll get together all the comments and questions that will be sent from the chat. But just if you allow me, Brian and Anne, one question that came out from some of the guests that will be joining the sessions or that are already joining. The term of social justice is something that ILO staff and many experts and scholars, they know exactly what they mean. But we have been asked in Greycells, what is the definition of social justice? What do you understand by social justice? Is there a universal definition, an accepted definition on social justice? Is social justice the same concept for rich countries and poor countries in any time? What would be the definition so that we can understand and make the link with the world of work? So with this, I will give you the floor if you have any comment, Manuela, on how we are going to develop the session.
Very simple, just write in a short sentence, insofar as possible, concise manner, your comment or questions in the chat, and then I will try to organize the ideas and interventions and convey them to the speakers immediately. Thank you.
So without further ado, then you have the floor, Anne and Brian, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Alejandro and Manuela. And thanks so much to Greycells for giving us this opportunity. Today, Brian Langille and I hope to share with you some insights from our recently published book, Social Justice and the World of Work, Possible Global Futures, and its launch. The volume features a rich array of critical perspectives and ideas about social justice in the context of work. And we'll come back to Alejandro's question later in the hour. It also talks about how to advance the cause of social justice in a post-pandemic crisis-racked world, which we are now living in. We decided on the title before the Director General Gilbert Ongbou of the International Labour Organization launched his own call for a global coalition for social justice, which the ILO governing body endorsed just last week. Why did we want to do this book? Well, first, it was clear to us that shifting geopolitical sands, climate change, persistent inequalities, artificial intelligence, the lessons from the pandemic, and more were shaking our ideas about the world of work and the place of regulation in it. We did not aim for an exhaustive treatment or a consensus, but rather fresh perspectives. And in 31 chapters, a wide range of thinkers look at the goals and challenges we face, as well as the means we have, or should have, to meet them. Our second motivation was wanting to honor the work of Francis Maupain, a former legal advisor of the ILO and advisor to many ILO directors general. At a book launch that took place early in the summer, which was kindly co-sponsored by the Swiss government and the Task platform in Geneva, Francis shared his thoughts on the future of the ILO, while commenting on many of the book's chapters, and we will again come back to his main ideas later today. The book contains a preface that traces Maupain's career and contributions to the field. Before we lead off with our introduction, part one of the book begins with a look at goals and challenges. And here Brian will provide some insights. Thank you. Over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Anne. Let me begin by repeating Anne's thanks for this invitation to be with you today, and with two preliminary remarks. First, what a pleasure it has been to work with Anne. She's a fabulous co-worker and the very best of co-editors and a tremendous ally. Second, let me add a second truth, that it is not only a pleasure to work with Anne, but to honor the Francis Maupain through that work. Francis is a dear friend and one of the most, if not the most admired figure in international labor law. He is widely regarded as a prince of international civil servant, a scholar, and a colleague. This second truth about Francis's stature, if it needed any further demonstration at this stage of his career, is evident in the list of those who contributed to the volume. The list of names, and we could not include all of those who would have loved to contribute, is in itself a beautiful tribute to Francis. You will see. For example, the book starts with Alain Soupiot, who leads off with a sweeping review of historical, philosophical, and political thought before setting out an alternative vision of mondialisation, which links human dignity and preservation and embellishment of the environment. Alberto Pruli continues along philosophical lines in his essay on social justice and the reform of capitalism. Then Adele Blackett, formerly of the ILO and now McGill, lays bare historical exclusions in labor law and all its transnational dimensions, which have led to a marginalization of issues that are in fact central. Also calling for a more holistic view of work is Kerry Rittick, my colleague at Toronto, who places flagship reports and statements of the ILO and the World Bank side by side to reveal blind spots in relation to labor beyond the market. The chapter by Jordi Agustí Peroneda takes a values-based perspective, linking Maupain's diplomatic and legal work to the flexibility that enabled the adoption of the ILO declarations of 1998 and 2008. Then Keith Ewing and Lord John Hendy from England look back to the Declaration of Philadelphia, asking why so little use has been made of the phrase, quote, a just share of the fruits of progress, close quote. They call for a much more robust commitment by the ILO and others. And just to go back to Alejandro's question, I think it's absolutely critical to approach this volume not with the idea that it seeks a consensus or a definition of social justice. Quite the opposite. This is an open invitation for a discussion from a variety of perspectives, taking a variety of approaches, variety of philosophical perspectives. It's not like a giant ocean liner sailing through the oceans with a destination in mind. This is much more like an open ocean yacht race with different crews on different boats with different riggings, doing different tacks in different meteorological and philosophical conditions. It's much richer than a single dogmatic, consensus-driven book. Anne?
Thanks very much, Brian. Before continuing, I want to say two things. One is I've just gotten a message that my internet connection is unstable, so I hope that stabilizes.
Well.
Secondly, I would also like to praise Brian as a really superb co-conspirator in this adventure. It's really been a pleasure working with you, and I think we've complemented each other well. Back to the book. Part 1 ends with several chapters that look at critical dimensions for labor law. These include the international area of environmental law in a chapter by Laurence Boisson de Chazorn of the University of Geneva, sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals in a chapter by Tonia Novitz of Bristol, the movement of peoples across borders in Seek of Work in 2 chapters by Alan Hyde and Virginia Mantuvalu, and persistent gender gaps in the world of work in a chapter by Shauna Olney, who also gives us some pointers for the future. Then we turn to means, first looking at the ILO and then the WTO, before moving on to the potential of regional systems. And here we'll ask Brian again to provide some thoughts.
Well, let's carry on apace. In a chapter on the epistemic authority of the ILO, Jan Klabers looks at the contributions of ILO staff to the development of international law and the law of international organizations. This is particularly apt in a volume dedicated to Francis Maupain, who served as a mentor to so many. The connection between international organizations from an ILO perspective is the topic of the chapter by Hoyoyama and Libby, who argue for placing social justice at the center of multilateralism. The chapter by Jean-Michel Servais focuses upon international labor standards. Their revision, standards revision, is addressed by Claire Lahovre, who focuses on the work of the standards review mechanism. The chapter by Shupriya Ruth, who takes a post-colonial perspective, challenges quite critically the legitimacy of the ILO structure. The book then moves on to institutions dealing with trade. Steve Charnovitz leads off with his chapter on reforming the WTO to promote social justice. Then Desiree Leclerc takes a hard look at the use of ILO standards in trade agreements and pleads for the ILO to set up a tribunal for an authoritative interpretation of ILO conventions, a view very recently and unfortunately, in my view, ignored. Over to Anne.
Thanks, Brian. Leclerc and some others refer to the tripartite dispute that has been paralyzing some aspects of the ILO supervisory machinery over the past few years around the right to strike. As you may already know, on November 10th, the ILO governing body decided by vote, not consensus, to ask the International Court of Justice to issue an advisory opinion. The question posed is the right to strike of workers and their organizations protected under the Freedom of Association and Protection of the Right to Organize Convention, 1948, number 87. Watch this space. I would, as perhaps we're used to having a dialogue, Brian and I would probably disagree about whether this was a good outcome or a bad outcome, but perhaps we can discuss that more in the period. Back to the book. It was clear to us that the regional dimension is a key element in the pursuit of social justice. In the book, Makane Mwesi of the University of Geneva focuses on achieving social justice through labor-related obligations in African investment treaty law and practice. Then, the innovative labor rights jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is put under the loop by Franz-Christian Ebert, now of the ILO, then of the Max Planck Institute. A look at the most relevant regional institutions would, of course, not be complete without the European Union, and Bruno Caruso and Veronica Papa explore this from the perspective of social sustainability. Clearly, intergovernmental organizations cannot do this job alone. So we cast our gaze as well to other public and private actors. Again, not exhaustive, but with some examples. First of all, Judy Fudge and Guy Mundlach. Judy is with McMaster University in Canada, and Guy with the University of Tel Aviv. They look at the attempts to litigate transnational labor law, not usually very successfully, and they point out that judges always have choices. In another chapter, Katerina Yanibas turns to the use of arbitration in resolving transnational labor disputes. She hones in on two instruments that were adopted in the wake of the Rana Plaza tragedy. Another tool, public procurement, can be powerfully harnessed to promote labor rights in global supply chains. This is explored in a chapter co-authored by Olga Martin Ortega and Martin Trosnak of the University of Greenwich. A more mixed picture on human rights and EU trade preferences in relation to Myanmar is painted by Richard Horsey, who served as the ILO representative in that country in the context of Commission of Inquiry, with which Maupain was quite closely connected, and its follow-up. Rounding out this section of the book is a piece by Isabel Dagaray, who looks at the contentious nature of regulation of occupational safety and health, and the rather fractious wrangling that has taken place between the ILO, the UN, and ISO on this topic. Isabelle Dagora is with the University of Bordeaux. This leads us to look at the regulation by labor law itself. And here we turn to Brian again. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Let me say to those who've tuned in, this is a bit much. This is a bit too much all at once, it seems to me. And we're trying to briefly get through a description of the book. In the second part of our remarks, I think we'll have a bit more of a coherent overall approach rather than trying to skip across all of these different topics quite so rapidly. But just to give you the final chapter and the flavor of the final set of chapters, Julio Lopez and Eusebio Colas from Barcelona point to the potential and dangers of artificial intelligence in relation to work and set out how trade unions at the national and EU level have been pushing for regulation at those levels and in collective bargaining. Another key area for labor regulation is working time with its critical gender dimension. This is tackled by Kirsten Schwei, who urges a move away from the so-called standard employment relationship in favor of a new paradigm that limits excessive working hours and overtime. The distance of that relationship from reality also lies at the center of the basic questions raised by Flavia Maximo Perea and Pedro Gravata Nicolai about subordinated labor in the global south. They lay bare the structural dimensions of traditional labor law and call for its reimagination from a post-colonial perspective. Also calling for such rethinking as Leah McHugh Russell's chapter on labor commodification and social justice in the household workplace, which points to the ILO standards and statistical methods. Finally, the volume offers Adrienne Golding's critique from South America of received notions around segmentation and pluralization. He argues for a broadening of social justice beyond waged employment, including universal social protection, unrelated to a person's occupational situation. Anne?
Thanks, Brian. I think what you just said also suggests that a notion of social justice inherently involves context, and that the context will help fill the meaning of that term. We mentioned earlier that Francis Maupain had spoken at the book launch at the Graduate Institute this past summer, and it's really impossible to summarize this in any kind of way that would do it justice, but let me just try to do that quickly before Brian will make some comments. Maupain began by evoking his personal and really lifelong quest to be of some service to the ILO by stimulating some positive reflections on its future. And we will be providing to the website the link that will allow you to actually read his remarks in full. The context is a multilateral system whose credibility is in deep trouble, Maupain notes. Fortunately, however, the ILO is in an exceptional position to mobilize, to correct, and to secure the coherence of the multilateral system to ensure the sustainability of the development process itself. This is because the ILO has a comparative advantage. It has several, in fact. But its promise, Maupain argues, is at some risk due to the erosion he sees in the will and capacity of the tripartite constituents to seize this historic moment. In support of this narrative, Maupain calls for identifying the institutional roots of the gaping disconnect between the proclaimed ambitions under the 2030 Agenda and the realities of persistent and worsening inequalities. For him, the root of the problem is how to make the distribution of the benefits and the burdens, the constraints of global interdependence, acceptable to all concerned. No easy task. It boils down to ensuring fairness, which is what social justice is all about in the context of globalization. He thus sees social justice as co-substantial to the concept of sustainable development. The ILO is, he feels, uniquely positioned to tackle this. But instead of the ILO acting as a subcontractor for the SDGs, as it does now, it should reactivate its role as universal tripartite legislator. A paradigm shift is needed. From the fight against inequalities to the establishment of conditions that are suitable for an acceptable sharing of the benefits and burdens of sustainable development. The ILO needs to persuade all its members of this. It has a mandate to do so, granted by the Declaration of Philadelphia, which is binding on its members and on the UN. It also has the legal instruments to do this, especially by exploiting paragraph 2C of that declaration and the potential of the 2008 Social Justice Declaration. This could, while incorporating an added environmental justice dimension, such as captured in the resolution adopted by last year's conference on just transitions, this could lead to adoption of a new ILO instrument, perhaps a recommendation. What would this do? It would spell out common guidelines for social and environmental policies in the context of global interdependence. This instrument could include a sort of peer review system, Maupain suggests. This would optimize the role and the institutional legitimacy of the International Labor Conference as a forum for an interactive debate to improve policy coherence within the multilateral system. This remarkable institutional setup can operate as an ongoing universal forum for a non-compartmentalized pursuit of a coherent and acceptable set of policies. This is, in large part, an account of institutional, that is to say, procedural justice. It would be a way, I would add, of making operational former Director General Somavia's call for policy coherence for a fair globalization, and perhaps embrace the increasingly loud calls for degrowth as a strategy in some areas. For Maupain, the ILO has the means, but he asks, does it have the will? He encourages the new Director General and staff to seize the ILO's potential. He appeals to workers and employers to rise above corporatist interests, and to governments, he urges them to stay the course in opening up participation within the framework of the ILO Constitution. His own career has shown time and again how to use an existing legal framework creatively to meet new challenges. As testimony, see, for example, the 1998 and 2008 declarations. Process is exactly where the ILO's institutional advantage resides. He is hopeful that what he calls Sleeping Beauty can be awakened. Brian, what do you think the prospects of that are?
I'll come to that at the end of my remarks about Francis's rather remarkable, quite coherent, breathtakingly so, take on our book. That is to say, to go back to Alejandro's opening question about definitions, Francis has taken the book and used it as a springboard to articulate a very coherent vision of how we need to address the issue of social justice. And as Anne has said, and I will reiterate in a moment, this is largely a procedural account. So it's not, Francis is not in the philosophical business of spelling out what social justice is and defining precisely what its elements would include and how it would balance all the conflicting parts of that. Rather, he has made a rather remarkable procedural move, which I'll try to explain more about in just a second. So, Alejandro, this is actually, if we're looking for some coherence, this is actually the part of the talk where things become less scattered and I think do cohere around a really nice set of ideas. Now, just to go back to some of the things that Anne said, Francis's paper and his ambitious outline of a future for the ILO, he seeks to awaken Sleeping Beauty, the ILO, who is now in a deep regulatory slumber, as he puts it. And he does so by saying some pretty basic and important things we should concentrate on for a second. First, we need to take our eyes off the surface of inequality and the surface of disenchantments with the current state of play and go deeper. As a result, we will aim higher. We need to shift from a plea for equality and solidarity in facing global issues to putting in place, or more correctly, seeing that we already have in place, the mechanism that is the process we need. The mechanism is not based on the idea of solidarity, but reciprocity. No more simply feeling sorry and pleading for help, but rather getting on with establishing the conditions, that is a process, which can deliver what is required, an acceptable distribution of benefits and burdens of interdependence. Not acceptable in some philosophically abstract sense, but acceptable to the nations of the world, all based on rational self-interest in a world of interdependence. One avenue of attack is, as Anne said, is to use ILO standard setting tools to encourage members to adopt integrated social and environmental policies. And here again, the key move is that it is the process itself, which is the key value added. The mission here is to empower citizens to have a fair share of the benefits and burdens of interdependence. As I read Maupain, this is the linchpin, that the way out of our current crisis in the system is to restore faith in its fairness at the level of the citizen. The key ingredients are empowerment, social protection, freedom of association, freedom of expression, to be heard on these issues. But the key is the procedural move away from solidarity to reciprocity as the operating principle. This is a very powerful and interesting insight. Maupain has long held the view that the primary tool that the ILO has at its disposal is persuasion. At the bottom of that belief is the further and even more basic view that the ILO's task is one of persuading its members that it is in their self-interest to pursue the cause of social justice at work and elsewhere. It is not against their self-interest. That is a view I share. It is not the dominant view. It does, however, have the virtue of being at the core of the ILO's constitutional principles. You'll recall the words, social justice is the precondition to universal peace. Further, Francis notes that the Declaration of Philadelphia is the institutional loophole through which the multilateral system can escape its existing silos on different issues of interdependence and negotiate across issues, thus permitting coherence and broader forms of reciprocity, which has been sadly lacking. Finally, and this is almost a throwaway line in Francis's paper, this is all a low-cost alternative to the rather large headache of reforming the multilateral system in place. He's really saying we have the bits, the processes, the institutions, the law we need. All we need is to see that and move forward. Now, think about this for a minute. The move that Francis is making about don't talk to me about solidarity, let's talk about reciprocity, is one that the World Trading System adopted. In economic theory, all nations should universally adopt free trade policies, but they do not. The World Trading System is one of negotiation and reciprocal arrangements. So too, all nations should unilaterally follow sustainable social, economic, and environmental policies. It is, as the ILO Constitution points out, the only way forward for humankind in the long term. But they do not. Francis is suggesting that a process based on the idea of reciprocity is the long-term answer to what nations see now as their short-term self-interest. Now, I close with three final remarks in the form of three questions. First, if Francis is right, is Danny Roderick wrong? And many of you will know Danny Roderick, one of the most insightful thinkers on our large global predicament. And he is famous, many of you will know, for the idea that we can see our current predicament and the history of our predicaments in terms of a trilemma, not a dilemma, but a trilemma. And Roderick's trilemma is based around the very important idea that there are three basic institutional choices we make in the world. One, hyperglobalization. 2, national sovereignty, and 3, democratic politics. We must imagine, if you like, a triangle with hyperglobalization on one point, democratic politics on another point, and national sovereignty on the other. And Roderick's point is we can only have one side of that triangle at one time. Now, at the moment, we have chosen, that's an interesting word, one in which we have hyperglobalization and the nation state, but we sacrifice the other side of the triangle, which is real democracy. We face that we've made that choice, having rejected the post-war choice, which was not hyperglobalization, but constrained globalization through the Bretton Woods Compromise. And it is the breakdown in that compromise that is ushered in the era of hyperglobalization. We have opted for not democracy and the nation state, but hyperglobalization and the nation state, but not democratic control. Now, for many people, the third choice available, hyperglobalization and democratic politics without national sovereignty, that is to say, global governments, global democracy, is just, Roderick thinks, a pipe dream. Now, it's just not a serious possibility in the world as we know it. For others, the problem with this is not this choice of democracy and hyperglobalization is not that it's a pipe dream, that it's deeply normatively, morally wrong. We need to retain an appropriate attachment to the notion of the nation state. This is the view of, for example, Martha Nussbaum, among others. Now, many in 1919, when the ILO came into being, wished for and imagined that they had designed such an institution of global democracy, the ILO, which would provide, they thought, global labor laws in the way that national legislators had hitherto created domestic labor legislation. That is, they imagined the world which Danny Roderick is calling a pipe dream of global governance. This turned out to be a misconception, as Francis Maupain has himself reminded us. The center of legal gravity for the ILO has been from the beginning and remains its possible influence on domestic laws within its members' states. So to answer my own question, I don't think Maupain is offering up global governments as the answer and proving Roderick wrong about its possibility. Rather, he is showing us a path back to a world of the first choice of democratic politics and national sovereignty, but no longer unconstrained hyperglobalization, rather a governed and restrained globalization. This turns out to be the path back to the Declaration of Philadelphia, and the way back there is via the ILO. My second question, is it possible for Maupain to offer a purely procedural account of global justice? I don't think so. I think all procedural accounts devolve in the end to some substantive set of values about real human freedom and capability. And I think Francis could bolster his case here by appealing to the work of Amartya Sen and others, including Martha Nussbaum, their ideas of human freedom and human capability. Now, my third question, and this is something Anne has already alluded to. At the outset of my remarks, I referred to Francis as a prince. And now, remarkably, in his remarks, Francis refers to the ILO as a sleeping beauty which needs to be roused from its regulatory slumber. Here's the question. Are Francis's ideas the kiss which is required to awaken the sleeping beauty? Now, that's a complicated question, not least because the sleeping beauty, who slumbers on that hilltop on the Route de Mont-Léon, is a complicated creature. Does that complicated creature prefer sleeping to waking and entering the fray? That's the question. And as in the fairy tale of the Sleeping Beauty, there is a tripartite reality. Will the three constituents who control the Sleeping Beauty's fate turn out to be good fairies or not? Can they and should they bring themselves to end the Sleeping Beauty's regulatory slumber? Francis has just asked and offered us a way of understanding the importance of that crucial question. He has also given his answers. For all of that, we are, once again, in Francis's debt. Now we wait to see if the Sleeping Beauty is awakened to a new post-slumber and vital future. Francis has laid out the case for why this should and how it could happen. He has done all that a prince can do. But, and this goes back to Anne's idea that we might have some real disagreement here, and this may be a bit provocative, the state of play currently at the ILO is not at all promising. In my view, the more the three agents of possible change waste their time contemplating and stirring up their current and dire state of internal affairs by, among other things, dreaming of ventures such as asking the court to issue an advisory opinion on the meaning of Convention 87, the more it is not dealing with all the major issues Francis has clearly identified. And as a result, we are in danger of witnessing a continuation of the ILO's regulatory sleepwalk. Thanks. Anne?
Thanks, Brian. I think hopefully we've laid the basis for a good discussion to come. Noting the time, I think I won't say more at this point, but open up the floor, or as perhaps that's for Alejandro to do, to comments and questions. There are a few things in the chat. Are there others?
You're already, Manuela is gathering all the questions now.
Okay.
Manuela, please.
Yes, I would like to put some order in the very interesting ideas that have been flagged in the chat. And insofar as I can see, the order would be around three main topics, so to speak. One concerns the policy coherence, the expression that you use several times within the UN system, where the ILO plays a key role in ensuring that policy coherence. And I am thinking particularly about this policy coherence vis-a-vis the future of the multilateralism, the current thinking around the reform of the UN system and the role of the ILO within that picture. So in that sense, certainly I would like to hear more about Roderick's trilemma, which for me it's very interesting because I come from the trading system and I apply a lot of Roderick thinking. So I would like to know more about this triangle: democracy, hyperglobalization, and national sovereignty, and how this trilemma can be applied in the policy coherence that the ILO is trying to build in the future. In this sense, it is related to a question regarding how the ILO can have influence on governments, considering the importance of lobbies, economic lobbies, of course, in the first place. What sort of influence? You said persuasion, but is that enough? A third question relates to the issue of reciprocity that you also mentioned, and how to implement it in practical terms, not only from the ILO perspective, but overall within the UN system and the social justice that should be one of the goals. In the trading system, special and differential treatment is the formula that was found to compensate the imbalances. I don't know if we have some equivalent applicable to the thinking on social justice from the ILO perspective. And finally, also regarding the role of the ILO, what is the position of workers and employers on this notion and this debate on social justice, not only today, but also in the past, I guess? Well, these are basically some of the ideas that come out from the comments and questions.
Anne, do you want to start?
I'll just briefly reply to one of the questions that was asked in relation to how the ILO could influence governments. I think the idea of having the International Labour Conference act as a forum for a genuine debate, not just among the ILO constituents, but also drawing in others, and in particular, inviting other multilateral institutions who have an impact on governments, for example, the WTO, for example, the international financial institutions. And here I'm referring not only to the World Bank, but also the various regional development banks, in addition to the IMF. the OECD, others, to have a dialogue that would in fact do what the Declaration of Philadelphia instructs the ILO to do, which is to put policies under examination to see whether or not they are in fact serving the goals for which the ILO was created. And at the moment, this really doesn't happen very much. And I think Brian mentioned the chapter by Carrie Rittick, where she actually takes two documents, major policy documents issued by the ILO and by the World Bank on a similar topic, and pulls apart how are they actually analyzing the issues? Are they drawing on different sources to reach different conclusions? Do they share some perspective? And most of all, where are the blind spots of each when they look at these particular issues? I mean, at the end of the day, in the national capital, it's one government that takes action. And yet they send different people to different multilateral institutions, and they're not necessarily speaking the same language. They're not thinking about how their own absence of linked up government creates chaos, not just internally, but also at the multilateral level. And to me, what I find really the added value of what the ideas that Maupain is throwing out is that he's proposing something that could be done now. You don't need to reform the ILO to make this happen. You simply need to have the ILO use the tools it has now available. And that's a great strength. We could all imagine how you could have a more coherent multilateral organizational framework. Is it going to happen? Look at what's going on right now in the world today, and the absolute absence of coming together around what everybody thought were pretty clear topics, pretty clear values. I think the level of crisis of the international system cannot be underestimated. And we really do need to look at what can we do here and now to try to come back from the brink. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just jump on this? Thank you, Anne. It was lovely. Who can be against coherence? I mean, this is one of these words that has nobody likes incoherence. Everybody likes coherence. So the idea of a coherence agenda is enormously appealing. And I think in each of our domestic situations in Canada, we need coherence between what we're doing domestically and what we're doing internationally. We need coherence across a number of different agendas. But fundamentally, I think Anne put her finger on it at the end there. We said what I think of as deep coherence, not just vertical coherence between domestic, international, and horizontal coherence across the international. We need some deep coherence sounding in what we thought and should be pretty important values, which for me are best thought of in terms of human freedom and human capability, using Amartya Sen's language. Now, and we are in a period of deep crisis. Now, so everybody's attracted to the idea of coherence, but we live in a world in which at the international everything is siloed. And I've always been struck in all my time visiting the ILO that, the problem here is one of having created single issue institutions, that the trades we need to make between different issues are just tied up in different institutions, and we send different people to the ILO as opposed to the IFIs and to other international fora. So it's very hard for Canada to get, the like horizontal coherence among its views of all these different institutions, and we're not at all coherent. Now, so the plea for coherence is simple, it's compelling, and this is not a novel insight, that this is what we seek. What Francis has done, in my view, is say, look, there is a available route to a process to start to achieve this sort of coherence. It's through the Declaration of Philadelphia. It's at the ILO. This is not a matter of wishing for a law that demands coherence. It is there. It's not a matter of wishing that the ILO could do this. It can do it. Right? It's a matter of seeing this and actually having the will to push forward. And that's the great stumbling point. I actually think when Francis gets to the end of his paper, he's really pleading with the tripartite constituents to see the potential that's already there. And, rather than remaking the international multilateral system, the path forward is there. And the key idea of reciprocity and being able to have reciprocity not within the silo of the ILO agenda, but across the multilateral system, which is what, in his view, and I think many people's view, the Declaration of Philadelphia actually demands, that is a very powerful insight. It also is hopeful because it is doable, right? That it doesn't involve creating new institutions. Let me just finish with this. This is one of Francis's greatest talents, is seeing that we don't need constitutional change, or we don't need new organizations, we don't need new anything. We just have to use the tools we have available, and we can achieve a great deal. So that's it. At a pragmatic level, it's really a charming proposal he's got here, which is, this is all in the bag. This is all here. It's just a matter of willpower to utilize the tools that we need and see that the big problem is the unfairness of the distribution of burdens and benefits. We need a mechanism to get some agreement around a just, fair, reciprocally agreeable set of arrangements. Anyway, thanks. I think Francis's paper has taken the chaos of the book, if you like, or all the ideas in the book, and said, look, there's a lot of good stuff in the book, and he uses it to inform his paper, but he's actually saying, he's leading us forward, saying, look, in the light of everything everybody has said about all the problems, here is a doable path into the future that we want for our children. Thanks.
I would agree with that 100%. And I think it's really, it's to Francis's credit that he's invested so much thought in trying to take what is, as we said, an array of views and pull out the really critical strands that you need to cope with in order to propose something that is doable now. I see from the pictures on the screen that there are a lot of wonderful former ILO colleagues who I'm sure would have their own insights into this as well. And indeed, a pioneer in the theory of the ILO, who is Yves Beigbeder as well. Just wanted to acknowledge his presence here and thank him for coming.
Thank you very much. Can I be a little bit provocative regarding what you just said on the role of the ILO as the center of the multilateral system, ensuring policy coherence beyond the silos? But an outsider could also ask you why the ILO has this center role. Why not the Human Rights Council? Is it only because it has a tripartite structure or a history that is much more rich than the Human Rights Council, or a body of regulations, conventions, and recommendations? Or why the ILO specifically? And somebody else could also say, well, yeah, but the WTO and the World Bank and the IMF have much more teeth because they have the financial power, which is extremely effective, as you know, to convince, quote and unquote, governments to do this and this and that. So I'm wondering if, of course, I am totally ILO. That's not my own personal view, but I'm thinking about, the voices outside there regarding the policy coherence and how to implement it. Do you have any reactions on that?
I think there's kind of a couple of reactions. I think Francis's point is that the ILO is uniquely legally empowered in a way that other institutions in the system are not. And for him, the Declaration of Philadelphia, the basic commitments in the ILO Constitution, that social justice is the precondition to eternal peace, that this is actually a broad mandate, and also it has the processes. That what he's looking for is an ongoing process of negotiation, reciprocal sharing of benefits and burdens across the silos. And he's saying, lo and behold, the way I see it, there is a place, there is a process, there is a mandate, there is a legally binding commitment, and it's here. It's not that it couldn't be somewhere else, but it is here. And if you go back to the original founding of the ILO, there's some remarkable insights about the ILO not really being the International Labor Organization. It's the International Social Justice Organization. That is actually fundamental, and that's the fundamental, if you like, basis of everything underlying the whole multilateral system. And I don't know, man, what do you think? I don't know whether Francis is precluding saying maybe one could find other ways of doing this, but I think he's saying we don't have to create a new organization. We don't have to have constitutional reform at these other organizations to expand their mandates, to kind of make them capable of seeing across all these silos. We already have it. And this is a very pragmatic kind of Francis-like conclusion, which I admire.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He's clearly saying that it has to go through member states, and that there has to be the persuasion of member states that it's in their own interest to use these existing tools. All well and good. There is a comment in the chat, I think that's worth reacting to, and that has to do with the reality of our world, in which the power of certain multinational corporations and the resources far outstrip many member states, not to mention, of course, the ILO. That is a dilemma that I don't think it's possible to come to grips with easily. And it's certainly an area where a lot more work is needed. Perhaps there were hints of that in Francis's proposal that the International Labour Conference be more open to hearing other voices. There are flexible tools in the Constitution, in the rules of the conference, that permit that. Again, it depends on the will of the member states, of the employers and workers organizations, working together to try to get better outcomes.
Yes, I see in the chat, particularly in the two last question comments, issues related to the democratic processes that we have, as you just mentioned. I mean, the reality is what it is. And indeed, if social justice is related to policy coherence and to multilateral values and to democracy, then we are not looking at a very positive landscape. Particularly, for instance, John said democracies are so badly weakened these days, and Gersha is referring also to these short-term imperatives of the next elections. I mean, this kind of realpolitik considerations, how do you manage them? And indeed, I think that the linkage between social justice and democracy is something which is instinctive in our minds. And how we do accommodate then authoritarian regimes in that story.
Well, I think there has to be insistence on freedom of association. It's really at the core of the ILO, and defending it is at the bedrock of what the ILO does. Easier said than done, but absolutely critical. And it does dovetail with the ideas of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum about human capabilities, not just within the world of work, but beyond.
And
Brian?
to go back to Roderick's trilemma, I see this as a nice expansion here to a quadrilemma in the chat. I think Roderick's insight gives us a way of capturing the difficulty. It doesn't say, here is the process forward, or here's how we get out of this. It's, we used to be in one space, we're now on another. What we want to do is get back to where we were. And I think Francis is saying, here is a way of doing that. Here is a path forward. It's totally procedural. It's fraught with all these difficulties. But one of the things Roderick is on to is re-empowering democracies, re-empowering national democracy. I mean, the greatest threat, he says, is hyperglobalization. So and if national states see that, if Roderick's right, then he's given us kind of a big roadmap of the dilemma, the trilemma, as he puts it. And I see Francis is coming along saying, well, look, okay, we get that. Now here is actually an existing institutional avenue for getting to where we need to go. Now, along the way, there are just horrendous problems. And I don't know, maybe everybody on the meeting is more depressed, this week than they've ever been in their lives, or maybe not. But things don't seem to be going terribly well along many of these dimensions. But all one can do is do what Francis is doing and say, look, here's an explanation of why things are bad. Here's how we got here. Here's a way forward. Let's work on that. He's also very good. I mean, I think he's saying, re-empowering national governments and thus re-empowering the participation level at the ILO is really part of what can happen here, that he's offering us a way of revitalizing the level of attention the ILO gets. But this, it's going to take a lot of meetings and a lot of people reading Francis's work to get this idea more publicly broadcast. But I think it's a very attractive, if very highly aspirational vision. And I think his first chore is to get the tripartite constituents within the ILO, as it kind of now is, to buy into the idea that there's a bigger game afoot if you guys want to get engaged in it. And this could be a very exciting, very important place. It's just a question of seeing that we could do that. And that's the first task, right? The first task is understanding that something is possible. The rest, mobilizing towards that end, comes afterwards. We have to have something to mobilize towards, something to organize for, some basic project going forward. And for all the difficulties that that entails, it's never going to happen unless we have somebody like Francis come along and say, here is a path forward, right? And we should get going on that.
Sounds good. Can I just end my comments by saying we're really pleased that the book stimulated Francis's thinking, and we hope that people will take a look at the book, which, by the way, is right behind Brian's head. If you could just move quickly. It has optimistic colors on the cover because we thought possible global futures should include positive thinking. On that note, thank you so much for having this conversation with us, and we hope you enjoy reading the book and Francis's comments. Thank you very much.
Well,
thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, both of you. Alejandro, maybe a closing word?
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you really very much to you, Anne and Brian. This was really a very rich dialogue. Many thanks for explaining for non-experts what the content of the book is. I was present at the presentation of the graduate student, and I didn't grasp all the elements that you as an expert have shared with us. But I have to mention that I'm a bit surprised of the parallels that we heard in this Greytalk by legal experts and the Greytalk we had last week on the financial aspects of sustainable development. The word they used were almost exactly the same. We have the means, we have the capacity, but do we have the will? And they made a plea for coherence. They mentioned, just like Brian did, that everything it's on the back, but we have to have a clear purpose of the financing that we are doing. and I will not extend the discussion, but I would have just the same question. I am not asking you to respond to it. The issue of democracy and sustainability. Sustainable Development Goals call for continuity. And if democracy works, governments will change of sign every 4 to 5 years everywhere. So the representation, not only in the ILO, but in the other agencies, will change the direction and they'll have different priorities. So how can we manage this, some kind of contradiction of allowing democracy to change, to move, to change from right to left to middle to whatever, and then ensure some kind of continuity. And the other issue that was present during the discussion on financial elements that I think it's also an issue when we're discussing social justice is the shadow cost. What is the cost of not doing it? What is the cost of not following Francis Maupain? And is this cost getting greater through time? So if we take decisions now as we can, because everything is there, the cost of not doing it would be greater next year and the year after. So there's always a shadow cost of not doing things. So I sent something like 5 or 6 questions to Manuela, but I think we have to leave that for our internal discussions in Gray Cells. Well, thank you really very much, Anne and
Thank you.
Brian, for this very exciting and motivating Greytalk. We'll keep you in our mailing list if you agree, so that we can share with you the information of the future ones and our big events, which are, of course, the intergenerational dialogues that we're having. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the participants for sharing this, and see you in our next activity. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.